I've got a few reasons for why I think ADM is bad for everyone, including dealerships. Now, I realize that I'm very privileged to work at a dealership that doesn't charge ADM, but I think I wouldn't feel any differently about it because there's a whole faction of the community that I see online commenting on things and, trying to help give people buying advice and saying like, hey, that's added dealer markup. That's not something that you should have to pay. So ADM can show up in many different forms. It can be just added dealer markup, right? What the acronym stands for. And I've seen this on hang tags. People send me hang tags all the time and say, Mickey, look at this. They're adding $5,000, $8,000, $13,000, $15,000 as brazenly as they could just on a line that says add a dealer markup. Some people will kind of market it as like a market adjustment. And other times these fees can show up on different lines under different names as like setup fees, prep fees. Again, I'm very fortunate where I work. We mirror Harley-Davidson's pricing. So we have MSRP, you have any optional features that you may want on your bike, whether it's black trim or a certain color or adaptive ride height or a different wheel option. And then Harley charges freight. And if you live in California, I like the fact that we have a California emissions charge because then everyone else, the other 49 states, aren't penalized for that. And just the California bikes can pay that $200 fee. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't like the emissions fee, but I'm glad that the entire country and the entire ocean of motorcycles that are being produced are not all subject to that same cost. And then in most states, you're going to have sales tax. Like we have a pretty high sales tax in California. And then you're going to have whatever your DMV fees are, your MVD fees, whatever you call it in your state. And your DMV fees may include a documentary fee. Like we charge an $85 documentary fee. So anything grossly above those basic line items are added dealer markup. They fall under that umbrella of the dealer is adding this charge and it's not necessarily coming from the manufacturer. So this is completely legal. Dealerships can charge whatever they want for their inventory. They paid for it, they bought it, they can resell it at whatever price they want to sell it at. And I see it in the comments a lot. Like if you follow r/Harley on Reddit, you'll see a lot of people will post their bill of sale or their quote that they get from a dealership and it'll have line items on there. And by the time I see the post, there's already 25, 30 people that have commented and say, hey, that prep fee, that's an additional fee. Oh, that tire fee, that battery fee. They're charging $795 for the documentary fee. So I feel like a lot of people have that understanding and are willing to point those things out to other people. But also this hopefully educates other people as you're coming up, because it's almost every day that I meet someone and talk to someone who is shopping for their very first bike. And if you haven't worked in this industry or been exposed to this industry for an extended amount of time, these are things that you may not know. And the reason I think it's bad for everyone, whether it's the customer or the dealership or for trade-in value or whomever else is involved, the reason it's bad is because as you inflate the price, you are putting your customer further away from their next purchase, and myself included. I'm a normal person. I make a normal amount of money, and I can't buy a $30,000 bike every month. I can't do it every 6 months. I can't do it every year. So if that's a $30,000 bike, okay, well, maybe I'm 4 to 5 years in between buying those things. Now you inflate the price to 35, to 40, to 50, 55. And now it's putting me even further away from my next purchase. And this happens a lot from people who are trying to trade their bike in. They've been paying for 3 years, on-time payments, they put a good chunk of money down, and then we look at their payoff, we evaluate their bike, and they owe more than what MSRP was originally 3 years ago when they bought the bike. And the only way that this is possible is if you overpaid for the bike in the first place. And that's to say that you didn't roll other things in. Like you didn't roll in a bunch of extra parts, like $5,000 worth of parts and $8,000 worth of negative equity on the trade that you traded in. But just the purchase of the bike, if after 3 years of payments, you either have an astronomically high interest rate or you might have paid some markup. And I see the disappointment and frustration on customers' faces when they see how these numbers shake out. And I know how discouraging that is because oftentimes financially they're not in a position to trade in and they're not in a position to buy another bike. And that's bad for dealerships. So in my small logical brain, I would think like, hey, I want this person to come back and continue to be a patron of my business as often as they possibly can. And if I overcharge them and I bury them inside of a bike with dealer markup, sure, I may have cashed in the short term, but I'm not going to get that customer to come back and purchase from me again. And I think this validates a lot of people's disdain and distrust for dealerships in general, whether this is automotive dealerships or motorcycle dealerships. I think there's already a basic understanding that, like, hey, the dealership is trying to screw you every chance they get. And I can think of nothing worse for the community than for all the people shopping in the community to be frustrated by how much money they had to spend to be in the community itself. And this can go even further down the line. So let's say, hey, I don't buy new bikes. I only buy used bikes. Well, the only way to have used bikes is for people to buy new bikes at some point. And if all of them are paying a dealer markup, that is going to trickle down and affect the value and their expectation for what they think they should be able to sell their bike for. So it still affects the used market as well, because, hey, I'm going to go into a dealership. They're going to offer me a wholesale trade number for my bike. I'm just going to sell it on the street. And suddenly you're like, well, if I'm going to sell it on the street, I'm going to at least pay off my loan and what I owe on the bike. And if it's that same guy who's been paying on it for 3 years, he owes MSRP and he's going to try to get MSRP for it, even though the bike is 3 years old. The fact remains that the markup that he paid is going to trickle down to the next person that buys that bike. So this is not an indictment on a dealership that chooses to do dealer markup, or if you work at a dealership that does add a dealer markup. This is not an indictment on that. This is just my perspective on the ripple effect that this can have on the community and how it puts customers at a disadvantage. And I've been there. I've only been in this industry for a little bit less than 4 years. And before that, I was buying cars, I was buying bikes. I've only ever bought one new vehicle prior to working at Laidlaw's, and that was a Toyota Tacoma I bought in 2001, and I paid markup. I didn't know how this stuff worked. In 2001, I would have been, 20 years old. And even though I have a hard time remembering that far back, I remember that I didn't know what I was doing. I just went in there and I let them dictate the numbers to me, and I said, well, I want the truck, so it looks like this is what I'm going to have to do. And I think now, decades later, people are a lot more educated on how these things work. And I think that's a really good thing. One of the things that warms my heart is when I am looking in the comment section and I see people talking to each other and kind of advising each other and saying like, hey, you might want to ask for this, or this is how this works. And that's kind of why I do, the more informative and educational videos, is because I really think it's a good thing for us to have this information and to know what you're walking into, especially if you're new to the industry, so you don't walk in with such a bad taste in your mouth after your first experience of buying a motorcycle. So let's say the damage is already done. You've already bought your first bike. You didn't know what ADM was and you paid ADM. What do you do now? Well, you keep the bike and you keep paying on it. If you do want to upgrade, like let's say they put you on a bike, wasn't really the right bike for you, and you're like, you know what? I don't want to keep it. I really want to move on to something else. At the end of the day, you signed to pay that money. Whatever that price was, whatever the markup was, however much money that was, you already signed that contract and you're going to have to pay that money back at some point. So you don't necessarily have to stay with that bike. If you've got good enough credit and you apply for a new bike, you can trade that bike in. And if you lose a little bit of money, hopefully your approval on the next bike allows you to roll some of that negative equity over. But you're just going to carry that money over. That added dealer markup isn't just going to disappear and go away. And the used market doesn't want to absorb that for you. And to some degree, the used market has to absorb part of it. It's very hard to differentiate like, oh, well, I paid $3,000 in dealer markup and this is book value of what it is now, and I'm going to sell it on the used market for this. So I actually only lost $500 and they paid the other part of it, or vice versa, where nobody who's looking at the used market is going to pay more than X amount of dollars for a certain amount of bike. There's a lot of gray area in there. So it's really hard to tell. The bottom line is those dealerships are going to make that money, and that money is paid by someone. And whether it is split up in a pie by multiple owners over the next few years, or it's just one person carrying that negative equity over to the next bike. So at that point, all you can do is accept it and move forward. And whether that means you stay on the bike you're at because it maintains a lower payment, and maybe you're going to invest in that bike a little bit, make it a little bit more comfortable, customize it to yourself, or you're just going to bite the bullet and say, hey, I don't like it, and I want to have something I like, and you're going to carry that negative equity over to something different. And this also isn't an indictment on customers, but dealerships will continue to charge at a dealer markup if people continue to pay it. It's kind of like saying, hey, how much do you think I should sell this bike for? The answer that doesn't help is, well, it's worth whatever somebody's willing to pay for it. So if you price it too high and nobody shows any interest, nobody's asking you about it, nobody's making you any offers, then, it's not worth that asking price. And if you lower the price a little bit and somebody's interested, okay, well, now you can tell where your value is. And the opposite is true as well. So if you're selling a bike and you're able to convince somebody to pay 8,000 over or 10,000 over, then I guess that market adjustment is valid. And the more people continue to buy bikes with ADM included, the more it kind of makes dealerships say like, hey, well, this is what they're going for. So I don't have any grand solutions for this, whether, Harley should do this and force dealerships to do XYZ or anything like that. I think this comes down to more of a grassroots level of people saying that, hey, I'm not going to pay prices that are X amount of dollars over MSRP, and a fair price is a fair price. And we've all been on both sides of this conversation. We've all been a buyer on a vehicle, and we've all been a seller on a vehicle. But if you know me, then you know what I really care about is the people, and I care about the community. But the higher you make that barrier to entry, the less of us there are, and the less there are of us that are able to go out and do the things that we should be doing on our motorcycles. Now, this is very black and white for new bikes because there is MSRP pricing and because there is a website that you can go to and look at the pricing. This can have such a gray area for used bikes because it's very difficult to compare apples to apples in the used market because most bikes are customized in some way, shape, or form, and most bikes have some kind of mileage, whether it's very low mileage or extremely high mileage. So it can be very difficult to compare those with as much accuracy as you can compare brand new models that have an MSRP listed on the website and multiple dealerships with those bikes in stock. But that's kind of my take on ADM. I think if ADM were not a thing and everyone was at MSRP, it would level the playing field a lot, and you would be forcing dealerships to build relationships with customers. If that is the requisite, what is your unique value proposition? Because I can go to that dealership and get the same price. I can go to that dealership and get the same price. So what is unique about you and why should I shop for you? And that puts the dealership in a position where they have to earn the customer's business. And under that circumstance, if everything else is equal, you can go to this store and buy it, you can go to that store and buy it, you can go to this store and buy it. Why would you go to one store over another? And then you have people working for you and working to build a relationship with you and earning your business. At the end of the day, I don't think there are a whole lot of people out there who would voluntarily pay an added dealer markup. It might be the situation where you don't really realize it's there, and that feels disingenuous to me. And that to me says that your customer doesn't really have a clear understanding of what they're purchasing and how much it should cost. And if that's the precedent for how you're going to maintain your profitability, then you are more incentivized to deceive your customer than you are to be upfront, transparent, and earn their business. And when it comes down to it, you do business with places that you can trust for consistency, for pricing, for customer service, and then you're going to shop with people who you like. That's kind of how it works. Whether it's the product that you like, whether it's the service that you like, or the community, or maybe a combination of multiple different things. But you guys let me know. You know I love talking with you in the comments. What are your experiences with ADM? How do you get around ADM if all the dealerships around you all charge ADM? Like, what do you do with your purchase process there? And do you just bite the bullet? Do you only buy used? Or maybe you're like me and you made a mistake and you paid ADM once before and you're never going to do it again. I think that's like the grassroots approach to this, right? Is that like, well, none of us are going to pay ADM and therefore you're not going to sell anything if you're charging ADM. So, power to the people. Something like that. I'll see you on the next one, guys.